Good evening, everyone. If everybody could grab a seat, that would be wonderful. I think there's some empty ones in different parts of the audience. Good evening. My name is Toussaint Lossier. I'm an associate professor in the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies, and I direct the STEPIC program, the Social Thought and Political Economy program. Tonight's lecture is the 2025 James Baldwin Lecture, co-presented by the W.B. Du Bois Department of Afro-American Studies and the History Department. Each Baldwin lecture addresses issues connected to social, economic, and political justice and underpinnings in institutional racism. The lecture honors the late James Baldwin, who taught at UMass for several years. It was established by and made possible with generous support from History Department alumnus Alan J. Davis of the class of 1968, who I'm excited to share is in attendance tonight. On behalf of our departments, the college, and the university, we extend our gratitude to you. Just a round of applause. Tonight's lecture is also co-presented by the Josephine Eagle White Cultural Center and the Feinberg Series. Offered every other year by the History Department, this year's Feinberg Series is focusing on a theme, what are universities for? Struggles for the soul of higher education. The various events have explored the roots of the political, economic, and ethical crises in higher education, and the recordings of each are available online. The Feinberg Series is organized by the History Department, co-sponsored by 36 university partners, and made possible thanks to UMass alumnus Kenneth Feinberg. I just want to make a quick logistical note. If you are joining us via Zoom, closed captioning is available. Please consult the chat for instructions on how to enable it. And for Dr. Salaita's address, I'll be moderating a Q&A. And we welcome questions both in person and from Zoom attendees. If you are here on Zoom, you can submit your questions at any time using the Q&A tool. And we had a little bit of difficulty. It feels weird to call it a technical difficulty because it has to do with access to Zoom. But for folks who are looking to join us tonight, it should be possible to join either via YouTube or via Zoom. And then for those who are in person, which is like all of y'all, there'll be a book signing that will follow the event with a selection of Dr. Salaita's books available for purchase from Amherst Books. And then I want to offer a brief land acknowledgement, mostly to give us an opportunity to sit with and be conscious of the circumstances that make it possible for us to be here. As we should all know, UMass Amherst is located on the unceded homelands of the Patumcap Nation of the Norwottuck community. Given the focus of tonight's lecture and this year's Feinberg Series on the role of higher education in society, we might use this occasion to reflect on our university's contribution to indigenous land dispossession, as well as the carbon pollution, war, and other forms of violence that continue to kill, impoverish, and make refugees of indigenous and non-indigenous communities around the world. We might also recognize the university's enormous capacity to help solve these problems. The series is an invitation to us to reflect on these questions and to get involved in collective movements for justice and repair. Now I want to just take a couple more moments. I know y'all are waiting for me to get off the stage, but just to take a couple more moments to introduce the reason why we're all here, to hear from Dr. Stephen Salaita. Dr. Salaita is a professor of English and comparative literature at the American University in Cairo. He's the author of some 9 books, I think it is, hard to keep count. With his one of his most recent books being An Honest Living, a memoir, and more recently, a novel, Daughter, Son, Assassin, and his writings can be found on stevesalaita.com. But Dr. Salaita is also well known for events that took place in 2014. In the summer of that year, um, um, Dr. Salaita, as a renowned scholar in American Indian Studies, had his appointment to the tenured professorship at the University of Illinois revoked by the Board of Trustees for University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign. His employment was terminated in response to his public tweets criticizing the Israeli government's summer assault on Gaza. Dr. Salaita's firing generated a huge public outcry, with thousands petitioning for his reinstatement and more than 5,000 scholars pledging to boycott the University of Illinois on his behalf. His case raised important questions about academic freedom, free speech on campus, and the movement for justice in Palestine. Now, being really a decade out from those events, there's really hardly anyone we could think more appropriate to give us an opportunity to reflect fundamentally on some of the core questions at work today. For those of us here at UMass Amherst, we find ourselves to some degree in a bubble, but very much in a wider maelstrom of political crises, debates, discussions, with, in many ways, universities sort of unwittingly at the center of both cultural wars, exertions of administrative power, and questions of fundamental constitutional rights. And so I really want to give us an opportunity to hear from Dr. Salaita to speak about some of these fundamental questions that touch on our day-to-day lives here on campus. The title of Dr. Salaita's talk is The Meaning of Honesty in Academe, and I want to ask you to join me in welcoming him to the stage.
Can you hear me well? It's okay. If the voice pitches too loudly or trails off, please let me know, and I'll try to adjust. I want first of all to thank you for coming out this evening. It's a pleasure and an honor to share this room with you. And it's an honor to be here at UMass. I was here some years ago, and so it's really nice to be back. If you can bear with me, I also want to offer deep gratitude to Dr. Dissent for the invitation. I don't make it out into the world much anymore. I kind of just try to stay in my life. I don't really give these talks anymore, for various reasons. But when he reached out with the opportunity to come to UMass, to deal with these questions about the current state of academe, and really to walk somehow in the footsteps of James Baldwin, it was impossible to say no, and I'm very, very glad to be here. I want also to thank Dr. Jess Johnson. She has been phenomenal. The logistics of getting me to Western Massachusetts from Cairo were difficult, and I'm afraid I probably made them more difficult than they needed to be. But just tremendous patience and professionalism and just good humor in general. I'm grateful for that, as well as to the Baldwin Foundation and the Feinberg series and James Davis. Thank you for entrusting me with this space this evening. I'll begin with a comment that may or may not resonate. The United States is going to hell. Is this comment an observable fact, or is it merely a perception? If observable, then based on what metrics? If perception, then what are the conditions that might lend it credence? Here are some observable facts. The USA's industrial base is gone. replaced by a technocratic economy which aggregates wealth among the elite at a faster rate than any society in human history. Health outcomes are poor. Housing is a serious problem. Wages can't keep up with inflation. Everywhere are signs of ecological crisis. Most people are indentured to debtors. Police can abuse and kill with impunity. Poor communities exist as corporate dumping grounds. The US political system is completely beholden to wealthy donors. Both major parties enthusiastically support genocide. Here are some perceptions. If you're not a wealthy donor or a potential source of wealth in general, then politicians despise you and govern accordingly. New variations of Nazism feel like they're now ubiquitous. Anger and alienation dominate the zeitgeist. Imperialism shows no signs of abating. Reactionaries keep winning the culture wars. The idea of social welfare is anathema to US cultural sensibilities. There's a general sense of doom in the atmosphere, and electoralism promises no meaningful solution to any of these problems. There are other ways of thinking about the United States going to hell. Let's say as a moral proposition. It is going to hell because of the evil it performs in this world. It is going to hell as a cosmic punishment. It is going to hell as an ontological conundrum. It is going to hell because it never charted any other destiny. Maybe I'm talking nonsense. Maybe I'm ranting my way into something of value. It's hard to say because I have a difficult time distinguishing absurdity from utility these days. I'm in something of an uncertain state wherein I still care deeply about the spaces I inhabit and the world surrounding them, but see little reason to expect a corrective to the problems amassing faster than my capacity to understand. My condition isn't malaise or nihilism, nor is it indifference or cynicism. Not exactly, or not directly anyway. All of these phenomena are perhaps evident in the condition, but all told, it's something different, emerging from and thereby suited to this moment. I cared about the recent election, for example, but I also didn't give a damn. A lot of factors can influence a person's voting decisions, but in the end, a brutal reality governs the democratic economy in the United States. Voters had no option for compassion, for vitality, for the cessation of genocide. And I care about what people are saying about the genocide in Gaza, but I find the commentary to be largely unbearable. It's not that the commentary is always insipid or opportunistic, although it often is. And it's not that it doesn't always feel meaningful per se. Every now and again it does. But that it doesn't seem consequential. People aren't talking into a void necessarily, but altogether the commentary is a looping chorus recited to the pleasure of a diminishing audience. We can make our feelings known, demand adherence to this or that ideological purview, and influence a great many people. Opinion polls, in fact, heavily favor an end to Israel's violence, and evidence has emerged that the Democratic Party's participation in the Zionist genocide cost it dearly last November. None of this stuff changed a goddamn thing in Gaza. I'm not saying that agitation on the street or in the public sphere is useless, or that we should always measure our efforts by their effect on centers of power. Rather, I'm pointing to the inherent limitations of dissent under regimes of capitalism. The remaining myths of American democracy that many people still held on to died for good these past several months, or at least they should have. What the people want is of no concern to the ruling class and its quislings. This recognition is the basis of the condition I describe. It's a particular type of ethos, neither binary nor fatalistic, that strives for relief against reactionary forces that increasingly feel insuperable. Pardon my presumptuousness, but I dare say that I'm not alone. I recognize it all the time in others. I recognize it on some of the faces at which I gaze right now. I suppose in the end, it's because I'm feeling politics more than thinking them. And that's why I don't want to talk about them or can't do it very well when I try. Because once I realized that our supposed freedom to speak is meaningless without guns or dollars, because without a dictate attached to whatever analysis I proffer, however germane or dazzling, I simultaneously realized that speaking won't stop a single Palestinian or Haitian or Sudanese or Yemeni or Congolese from getting murdered. So what's left? What's always left? The same desire for the language of joy and discontent to matter. I just want to identify a legitimate basis for possibility, where children are loved and well-fed, where workers can afford leisure, where good health doesn't require bankruptcy, where our taps produce unpoisoned water, where ecosystems survive industrialization, where roofs cover bedrooms and blankets cover beds, where genocide is always a red line, where the unloved, the destitute, the surplus finally enjoy refuge, or better, succor, because this kind of world isn't getting theorized into existence without a material power to accompany our words, and it's not coming about through our magnanimous thoughts and well-reasoned opinions, those noble activities that too often function as commodities for social climbing and podcast subscriptions. But still, it has to happen, this kind of world, which, corny though it sounds, is the current state of my politics. In other words, how I am feeling, a burning ambition without basis in the environs I inhabit, that it must happen somewhere, anywhere, inshallah, everywhere. Here's a consequent observation. If the United States is going to hell, then Academe is going to hell. Maybe it's already there, and this gathering is just a manifestation of our collective damnation. I like to think of it as an exception or a respite, but there's no way to be sure. I've been chewing on the relationship between academe and politics, academe and self-fulfillment, academe and notions of the public good. Certainly, I'm not alone in doing so. Academics and observers have been exploring these intersections for decades or centuries in some cases. Still, it strikes me as important to conduct a reassessment in light of today's problems, the Gaza genocide in particular. So my experience as a professor has been tumultuous. I was almost fired, outright fired, and de facto fired, all within the space of a few years. Then I couldn't get a job anywhere, so I moved on to other pursuits, mostly unemployment. 5 years later, I was hired into an untenured faculty position at the American University in Cairo. It's one of the few universities in the world where I'm employable, and I arrived in Egypt through an incredible confluence of luck and opportunity. When my academic career first went to hell, my son was a toddler, and I usually considered the implications in terms of his future. I wrote a lot about my obligations as a father in relation to the ethics I wanted to uphold as a professional. I hated that the two concerns, professional security and ethical praxis, seemed to be in fundamental conflict. I wanted them to be coterminous. But that's not how the capitalist regime of the United States is organized. Serving the interests of the dispossessed necessarily subjects one to dispossession. There's no getting around it. It's one way among many that the ruling class so effectively coerces obedience. About 10 years ago, I used to sit in my parents' garage late at night in Manassas, Virginia, where we moved after I was unceremoniously fired from a tenured position at the University of Illinois, having no means to pay rent. They live in a standard suburban townhouse with a garage halfway below ground level. I would chain smoke amid the bins and boxes holding our possessions and try to write out a deep sense of loneliness and frustration. Usually it was cold, and so I kept the garage door open about a foot, which wasn't enough to properly air out the space. I sat on the futon I used to keep in my campus office amid stale yellow vapor mixed with the dank smell of soggy cardboard and dried grass clippings. It was a decent place to write. I had plenty to say, but couldn't make sense of anything back then. My real education, 11 years after having completed a PhD, was just beginning. As is usually the case with people who have been harmed, but haven't yet discovered a language to process the aftermath, I was bitter and angry. It wasn't just that I had been publicly expunged from a faculty position. I knew that the good people out there who could help me back on my feet lacked the influence to return me to the classroom. I knew as well that Zionist defamation, which is uniquely intense and mean-spirited, would become a lifelong reality. I spent a lot of time especially thinking about how I, disgraced and unemployed, would provide for and protect my child. And I kept returning to the same rupture. My ability to protect my child required a kind of obsequiousness to the status quo, which would thus make me complicit in the insecurity of other people's children. I've contended with this rupture every single day since, whether I went to sleep in bliss or misery. I had one motivation throughout that chaotic period. I wanted my child to grow up to be proud of me. Whatever else happened, I was determined to bequeath to him the comfort of filial probity. I think it should be an aspiration for all parents. A few months ago, I was chatting with my son, then 12, about the usual tween stuff. He goes to an American school in Cairo, and as one might expect of this type of school, it's filled with very spoiled children. He knows about my employment fiascos of the past and the notoriety that followed because I told him last summer. I always dreaded having to do it, but he and his cousins had long since learned how to scour the internet, and I figured it was time he heard the story from me and asked whatever questions were on his mind. At the time, he offered no judgment. He was mostly interested in how lawsuits work. It also became clear to him why we likely wouldn't go back to the United States. No university there would hire me. It was an important recognition because he sometimes agitated about returning to Virginia. All four of his grandparents are there, aunts, uncles, cousins. It's tough being an only child separated from extended family. Anyway, he was telling me about all the fancy stuff many of his classmates own. Shoes mostly, Air Jordans and whatnot. Seventh graders are really into shoes, and I find it amusing that today's seventh graders are into the exact shoes we were into when I was in seventh grade. Another commonality is that my old man never bought me Air Jordans, and I haven't bought my son any either. I've been a lot less mean about it than my dad was, so to be fair. He was sad about it for the usual reasons. We were all in middle school once. We know what it's like. As professionals, we still know what it's like because so many of our workplace problems are guided by the same pubescent sensibilities we're supposed to help our children navigate. He interrupted one of my discourses about the dangers of material possessions to say, I don't think you should have done it. Done what? I asked. You know, that whole Palestine thing where you lost your job. I understand why you did it, but I wish you didn't. I heard him out, gave him a hug, and told him he'll soon be a man with his own tough decisions to make, then went on with the evening. There was a lot to unpack. I'm pleased that my son feels comfortable expressing his opinions and anxieties. It's important that children of all age groups can find a sympathetic audience, if only so they don't develop the habit of appending guilt to self-expression. There's also a benefit to adults who serve as that audience. We get the opportunity to reflect through points of view untainted by subjective material calculations. Whether at age 5 or 10 or 15, children are fantastic theorists if we take a moment to understand the assumptions guiding their logic. On the surface, my son was expressing angst typical of his age group. Beneath that angst, though, he was raising difficult questions that academics and other professionals have been trying to answer for a long time. To wit, how do we maintain decency in an environment that rewards subservience to power and punishes loyalty to the dispossessed? A quick aside, if you're wondering how it is that universities demand conformity to the status quo while lionizing debate and critical inquiry, the answer is straightforward. They don't have to be explicit about the demand because it's built into the same culture of intellectual freedom that they promote. In other words, these notions of intellectual freedom aren't anathema to conformity because reproduction of the status quo is imperative to the social life of the institution. An elaborate system of inducements, financial and psychological, exists to maintain a sort of political decorum that costs its stakeholders in the imperium, among them the university itself. The loud culture war between liberals and conservatives doesn't demonstrate ideological diversity. It is self-branding in a frivolous contest to collect the scraps of empire. The real schism is between anti-capitalists and everyone else, something the culture wars occlude to great effect. As to the question, I don't think people can maintain decency in academe without a serious disruption to their upward mobility. It all depends on how we define decency. If we conceptualize it as loyalty to the dispossessed, as I did a few seconds ago, then putting the sentiment into practice is a reliable way to invite recrimination. If you work or study on campus, then being forced into difficult choices is inevitable. Too many of our colleagues choose expedience and self-preservation over their apparent devotion to the wretched of the earth. We're supposed to be critical thinkers, though, which should lead us to understand that what might be perceived as expedient only produces collective harm in the long run. Self-preservation, too, is something of a misnomer because sucking up to management is no guarantee of individual gratification. You're just as likely to be disposed of as you are to ascend into a more dominant social class. That we're forced into this conflict isn't some peculiar lapse of diligence. It is a diligently calibrated system of coercion and punishment in which Zionism plays a critical role. It's quite effective in this role, too. When students and faculty revolted over the past 2 years, setting up encampments and in some cases occupying administrative buildings, they forced universities into a more honest posture. Those universities could no longer rely on the myths of mobility and merit to generate obedience. So they dropped the act altogether and turned into mini police states. The level of repression and persecution has been extraordinary. Students assaulted and expelled, diplomas rescinded, visas revoked, faculty suspended and fired, criminalization of speech opposing genocide, raids and imprisonment, cancellation of classes having anything to do with Palestine, on and on. It's been a long time since we've seen anything like it. This persecution is in service of Zionism, sure, but it is also an expression of the university's deepest sensibility. Zionism offers a pretextual basis for institutional authority. In the metropole, Zionism and institutional authority are mutually constitutive, and one functions optimally in relation to the other. I used to say, semi-jokingly, that they can't fire all of us, but it turns out that they can, or at least they'll try. which has a panoptical effect on our activities. There's no safety in numbers, not really. We need a countervailing power to the ruling class. Developing such power requires us to do things that have a reasonable chance of leading to trouble. My son understands this already, not through my stories of tumult, but by his own experience in the world. He sees rich people and poor people in Cairo. He knows who among them matter to educators, to news agencies, to politicians. He thinks I shouldn't have disrupted a steady career by defending Palestinians because the prospect of indigence is terribly discomfiting to a child. That's the thing about finding a radical principle and standing on it, though. If one isn't risking indigence, then in the end, that person is merely reciting an exotic narrative to the same old audience. Maybe my son will understand one day, maybe he won't. Like I told him, he'll unfortunately have multiple opportunities to decide for himself. So, how do we balance the security of employment with the practice of a meaningful politics? There's no singular answer. No answer really that I'm comfortable putting forward as definitive. It seems more useful to examine the nature of the question and make sense of the situation in which it exists. When I have an opportunity to give a talk, interlocutors often ask, what can I do? Which I consider a variation of the same question I raised a second ago. It's an important question, what can I do? And with a few exceptions, should be treated with care and respect. Why is the question so prevalent? And what does its prevalence tell us about the relationship between citizen and society? To begin with, it illuminates one of four things about the questioner. One, they're being disingenuous. Two, they're seeking validation for a pre-existing opinion. Three, they're overwhelmed or confused by the gravity of the moment. Or four, they're motivated and want to act on some issue of justice. I reckon that numbers 3 and 4 are the most common. All kinds of interesting assumptions underlie the question. For example, it suggests a lack of belief in the system. We already know what we're supposed to do, right? Vote, give the money to charity, join the PTA, vote some more. So anybody asking what can or should be done already knows on some level that the democratic process is bullshit. It also suggests that selling our labor or paying tuition to corrupt institutions in a society with deteriorating quality of life feels exactly like the prospect of indigence to a child. I'm probably being too severe, but I think that people who care enough to want to do something to improve the world in lasting and meaningful ways know deep down exactly what needs to be done. They're looking for ways for that action to be somehow compatible with job security, with personal freedom, or with notions of civic responsibility. So the first thing to be done then is rid yourself of the idea that the US polity is redeemable. It's not. Unchecked, it will only lead the world into catastrophe to the benefit of a few thousand technocratic psychopaths. Overthrowing the system and replacing it with something at least minimally humane is what needs to be done. Does that sound glib? It might. Unserious? Sure. Impossible? Almost certainly. But if the goal is equality and justice, or merely preventing ecocide, then we'd better get to doing it. Thus the ambiguity. There are no easy answers because the easiest answer is also the most onerous and least likely to be put forward. Nearly all the so-called radicalism in academe is a long-winded paean to conciliation. The second thing that needs to be done is giving up the idea of safety. It doesn't currently exist for opponents of US imperialism, to say nothing of its victims. And it won't exist until US imperialism is defeated. If you agitate against militarism, police brutality, corporate extraction, and Zionism, then you might well end up with a satisfying career, but there's an equal chance that you'll be forced onto the periphery, even among the many leftist formations in North America. On campus, these commitments only work as a branding device. Put into action, they become cause for mobbing, hostility, ostracism, and recrimination. I've lived this reality more than once. They're some of the unhappiest times of my life. But I've come to recognize that a lasting satisfaction arises from never having ceded a solitary centimeter to the oppressor. This is our first confrontation with the meaning of honesty in academe, the apocryphal and self-serving notion that you can desire revolutionary change while still maintaining the esteem of corporate media editors, NGOs, celebrity podcasters, donors, senior scholars, and the managerial class. If we're being honest about the nature of the corporate university, and if you're being honest about the depth of your commitment, then the honesty demands a realistic assessment of the dim outcome that results from actual loyalty to the dispossessed rather than implicit service to power. Let's stick with the topic. I've written a lot about the notion of honesty. My book, An Honest Living, is what led to my invitation to speak at UMass. Now, I've normally thought of honesty as a moral question. How does one maintain humanity in an environment that likes to reward mendacity? In An Honest Living, the answer is pretty straightforward. I removed myself from academe altogether and tried to find meaning at the wheel of a school bus. And it worked. I'm aware that a confluence of factors led to that outcome, and so there's really no universal counsel to derive from it. But I'd say that the underlying principle is relevant, whatever your situation. A refusal to internalize or reproduce the toxicity of institutional ambition. I've maintained this impetus to refuse in Cairo by doggedly focusing on my students' well-being and having a non-existent public profile, just slow and irregular writing without marketing for whoever cares to read it. I work in academe, but I'm not in academe. Now, your refusal can and probably should take a different course. As long as it prioritizes the disempowered, then it can lead to all kinds of interesting places in the world. Lately, I've been thinking about honesty as a methodology. Who represents the sensibilities of people whose political visions don't align with common wisdom in academe? In our bubbles, common wisdom always lands on something counter-revolutionary. There's nothing organic about that outcome. It's the upshot of an intellectual culture engineered by upper-class tastemakers and reproduced through the consent of supplicants chasing the petty rewards of compliance. Those supplicants are adept at dressing counter-revolutionary thought in radical adornments, but in moments of crisis, they revert to a default state of acquiescence. Take the past 18 months of unmitigated abuse of students protesting a genocide. Many honorable faculty joined those students or spoke in their defense, but they're an exception. A greater number of their colleagues who have built reputations and thus material comfort on big talk about fighting the power were absent from the front lines. This is a long-standing habit, by the way. Ask your local Marxist professor if he happened to take management's side during a grad student unionization drive, for example. What about all the people inside and beyond the United States for whom the term democracy is an empty signifier? Who among us represents their point of view? Forget representation. Who among us actually agrees with them? After all, we just witnessed nearly every leader of the so-called democratic West underwrite a genocide despite the adamant disapproval of their populations. How about the Palestinian resistance? It has significant support among people in the global South and among no small number of Black people, natives, Muslims, Chicanos, and other representative communities in North America. You won't find their points of view taken seriously by the professional decolonialists writing for liberal audiences in old money periodicals, Lewis Gordon, Adam Schatz, Pankaj Mishra, and so on. Instead, they offer a high-handed reverie about the natives' pathological violence. The scholars who do take resistance seriously get fired and suspended. Fact is, there's a world of opinion, some inspiring and some dubious, completely omitted from what cultured folks like to call dialogue. A lot of people think that US democracy is a sham, that soldiers shouldn't be glorified, that voting is a waste of time, that violence is sometimes necessary, that Israel has no right to exist. We can't be honest about it without risking trouble. So we revert to bourgeois common sense instead. Do you know who has excellent powers of perception when it comes to distinguishing artfulness from substance? Administrators. They have a finely tuned ear for nuance and subtext. They can read an article filled with references to Marx, Fanon, and Gramsci and immediately decide, this motherfucker doesn't have a radical bone in his body. The radicalism is concentrated in his tongue. They never make exceptions in their judgments, and so we needn't make excuses in ours. Finally, we can consider the meaning of honesty in terms of achieving justice for the downtrodden. If we're being honest about this possibility, let's say for Haitians, Congolese, Sudanese, Lakota, Kashmiris, and other oppressed national communities, then we have to engage the logic of the street, the shanty, the reservation, the refugee camp. This kind of approach will necessarily be distasteful to scholars writing for the foreign policy establishment. But there's an honesty inherent to it that good taste cannot apprehend. If the idea is to explore notions of freedom and democracy, then any honest assessment of the concepts in action will recognize that there are a whole lot of flim-flam deployed without scrutiny to simultaneously justify imperialism and pacify insurgency. In the real world, there's more power and less power. And aligning yourself with less power is an abdication of freedom and democracy. Earlier this evening, I mentioned a legitimate basis for possibility. In closing, I'd like to elaborate on this phrase. When I say possibility, of course, I mean the possibility of a livable future, especially for those who are given no place in this world. We all have different ideas of possibility, which can certainly create tension, but also adds richness to our social and interior lives. Wherever each of us exists on the ideological spectrum, it's important to remember that possibility exists precisely where the university occludes it. You cannot expect institutions housing ever distended strata of upper managers to offer themselves as sites of revolution. No matter what overheated reactionaries like to claim about leftism run amok on campus. These upper managers are deeply invested in maintaining order. Same goes for many current students and alumni. Try to elevate the downtrodden through access to campus resources, and a certain crowd will immediately run to the State House to cry about the degradation of their credentials. You cannot expect people to become class traders, in other words. This is why the language of civil liberties and human rights is so insidious. Same with the hyper-focus on diversity and personal agency and representation. It elides analysis of hostile class relations and dissuades alliances that might disrupt the upward flow of capital. Thus, capital folds the language of uplift and belonging into feel-good theatrics governed by an unacknowledged class antagonism. In this environment, speech is less a universal right than a limited commodity. There could be no James Baldwin today. He had exceptional talent, no doubt, but that's not what I mean. Through decades of refinement, the system is much more effective at co-opting or suppressing radicalism at its inception. Any line of thinking with potential to subvert corporate dominion, as with any insurgent mobilization, gets co-opted back into the same bourgeois machinery of voting, of tolerance and inclusion, of donating to ostensibly socialist politicians who revert to party dogma when it matters. Where co-optation fails, brute force steps in, as we've seen on campuses throughout the USA, the UK, Canada, Australia, and Germany. The anointed successor to Baldwin, Ta-Nehisi Coates, was a darling of the liberal establishment until he implicated the Zionist state in apartheid, at which point the same liberals unleashed a once latent racism on him that made them sound every bit the Trumpers that they deplore. The same has happened to every Black leader and intellectual since the 1960s. Baldwin, it's worth pointing out, opposed Zionism, but that opposition is largely absent from his historical profile, as is the case with other icons like Nelson Mandela and Muhammad Ali. You have to remember that discourse is fungible among centers of power. Rhetoricians of imperialism can append a humanistic lexicon to any violent ideology. There's not always a good reason to die, but there's always a good reason to kill. And people have been making some variation of this argument for a long time, going all the way back to Aristotle and Jesus. But with the Gaza genocide, we've just seen the process happen in real time, in big blinking lights. An American client state and fellow settler colony committed a genocide on camera. The entire corporate media apparatus joined with the political classes in justifying and in many cases celebrating the genocide. Institutions of higher education did the same. When the usual means of consent failed, liberals and conservatives set aside all pretext of civic responsibility and brutalized opponents of the genocide. There isn't a solitary excuse to humor all the usual banalities about free speech and human rights. So let's draw on our creativity, resourcefulness, resilience, and honesty to pursue ideas of liberation that transcend the empty signifiers imparted by thought leaders, politicians, intellectuals, podcasters, and the like. Remember, search for possibility at the point of occlusion. That's always the point at which it promises to be disruptive. What's practical and realistic, according to the ruling class, depends entirely on our immiseration. Possibility and impossibility are actually synonymous. I don't know. As I said, I'm having a tough time these days finding cause to be optimistic. I mean, no need to rehearse all the reasons. I'm sure I've depressed you quite enough already. Then I think about the people in Palestine, the people in Sudan, the people in Yemen, the people in the Congo, the people in Haiti, the people in Hawaii, the people all over the world who suffer penury so that coteries of insatiable scoundrels can accumulate wealth. At this point, I realize that for people of my station, cynicism is a luxury. For the downtrodden, optimism is a necessity, a survival mechanism. Human beings endure incredible abuse only to maintain their dignity and pass it along to ensuing generations. Therein lies my theoretical methodology. These human beings endure because they want to live and grow. They want to work and play. They want to see other lands and oceans. Nobody should expect anything more of them than survival. But their endurance isn't confined to a local milieu. They endure for the good of all humanity. A liberated Palestine is better for the world than a world indulging the Zionist entity. A society with food and housing security is better for the world than a world enraptured by the obscenities of wealth. A land base under indigenous stewardship is better for the world than a world owned by corporations. A sovereign Africa is better for the world than a world organized through Western exploitation. We endure for others so that others can endure for us. This is honesty in its most powerful incarnation. The challenges facing us appear indomitable. I sometimes limit my exposure to the news because it scares me. I'm okay admitting it. We're all scared, right? Those of us who aren't dead inside or beneficiaries of injustice anyway. But fear isn't a stand-in for cowardice. It is a prelude to courage. So let's join arms and march into hell, confident that we can transform it into something more heavenly than this rotten world. Thank you.
Oh, that was a really happy speech. No, I'm just joking. Well, one, thank you for the talk. And I first and foremost just appreciate the fact that I know that you started off by saying that you don't get out very often in terms of giving these kind of lectures. And I know there is a certain brand of kind of professional academic that can get into the habit of giving the same talk or a version of the same talk in multiple different places. So the fact that you wrote something specifically for your visit here, I think is to be appreciated. I wanted to ask, I have a couple questions that I want to ask. But first and foremost, I wanted to ask you to speak a little bit about one point that really captured my attention, really to the end point of your lecture, which was this question of searching for possibility at the point of occlusion. And I just wanted to know if you could maybe just elaborate on that, partly because I think some people in the audience who are looking forward to the midterm elections might be like, okay, Stephen Salaita told me that voting isn't going to do anything. So one, I think that's just want to speak to what you were identifying as the question of possibility in terms of the circumstances that we find ourselves in.
Sure. Is my mic working? Okay. Thank you very much. And again, thank you all for, for coming. So I'm nervous, not about what might happen, but about possibly an inability to articulate properly what I want to articulate. But let's take the question of voting, right, as point of inclusion. Okay, I don't even want to, to make a firm point that voting isn't inherently positive or negative. Do it if you want to do it. Don't do it if you don't want to do it. But think about the occlusions, the inherent occlusions of voting in the United States. Okay, at the local level, okay, right? It has a different nature. I'm thinking of congressional, senatorial, presidential races.
Can you explain what you mean by occlusions? Because we've got some maybe like high school students or freshmen who are in the audience, so just break it down for us.
Happy to do it. We're really the way that I'm thinking about it is where something is purposefully shielded from view, right? It's occluded, it's hidden, right? It can't be seen even though it's there. Does that make sense? I don't know if that's a good definition, but that's the one that in my mind, right? And so let's say you're going to vote in a congressional race or a Senate race or a presidential race or whatever. Okay, there are issues at play, right? I don't think that it can be said now that Trump is he's in his lane doing his thing, that the election doesn't change anything about the United States. Clearly there are changes happening in the United States, but I go back to an earlier point that I made in my talk. In the end, what is occluded from the election in this cycle? Genocide was occluded. Right, there was no option, right, to not vote for genocide or to reject genocide. All right, that's the nature of the system. It's limited in that particular way. So you search for possibility at the point of occlusion. Okay, so what's not here? What else was occluded from the election? Universal health care was occluded. Defunding of police was occluded. Right, all kinds of things that are important to people. Right, and I'm not even talking about I'm not even doing commie shit. Do you know what I'm talking about? Like just like basic social democratic stuff, right? Subsidized housing, affordable housing. That wasn't a possibility, right? None of these things were a possibility. Right? And so what's occluded is what we ought to set our focus on, because it's occluded for a reason, right? Because it's inherently a threat to the ruling class, however you want to define it. And another thing is you can look at the way that campuses operate. And I tried to touch on this a little bit in the talk. I mean, I've spent like 10 years ranting about this in various in various environments. But look at the way that the universities and here maybe I'm thinking before all of the overt crackdowns after October 7th, once the genocide began, and once Trump took office. But they love to hammer on about like diversity. We have a welcoming, multicultural, tolerant environment. Okay, these are all good things. Who but a horrible reactionary is going to read the pamphlet? I'm showing my age. Is going to look on the website, right, and see the they used to give us pamphlets, right? I never got any, but smart students used to get them, right? On the website and say, oh, well, diversity and inclusion and tolerance, these are terrible things. I don't want to go there. Right? Okay, that all sounds good. What does it sound like, right? To an earnest consumer. All right, this sounds like a place where I can learn, I can discuss things openly, right? They're talking about academic freedom and free speech and empowering students, right? Okay, let's say I'm a young Palestinian American student. I'm interested in this place. I can go to this place and I can talk about Palestine. The hell you can, right? I can go to this place and agitate against military recruitment on campus. No, you can't, right? I can go to this place and I can talk about, right, the way that police function as private agents for the accumulation of capital. No, you can't. That's what's occluded, right, from these notions of intellectual diversity and free speech and academic freedom and student empowerment, right? So all of these things happen within sort of a very restricted environment. And so I'm saying even among serious parts of the academic left, I think it's beginning to change. But opposition to Zionism is occluded. It just is. It is in a lot of unions, right? It just is, right? And so again, what's being occluded? All right, set my sights there, and that's going to tell me something extremely valuable, right, about what actually might be institutionally or politically disruptive. Does that make sense?
Thank you. Yeah, there's a follow-up question to that, but I want to actually kind of go in slightly different direction. So you started your talk off in a very like like from what I read as sort of like almost I was like, oh, there's hints of like the Black prophetic tradition, what have you. You know, the moment I was like, oh, is he trying to like do a whole what was the Jeremiah Wright thing? I was like, I spent too much time in Chicago. I was like, is this like, you know, Nation of Islam kind of, you know, fire and brimstone, what have you. And I was going to push back on you. I think one of the things that I that left me sort of curious is amidst that sort of fire and brimstone, at least for my people, there's also a question of like we have to get through this together, right? When I teach The Fire Next Time by James Baldwin, there's a lot of what you spoke to in terms of how to process the world that you're in through your relationships with your loved ones. But there's also a sense of, you know, in that sort of like epistolary fashion of like, I'm writing to my nephews or what have you, a question of, you know, the world outside might not love you, but, you know, we love you, right? And that kind of raised the question to me of the place of solidarity. And you talk about it in your book in a way that speaks to a real frustration in some sense. And I'm thinking more of the experience that you had in Lebanon more than anything, of the limits of solidarity, particularly within the academy. And I'm not saying this necessarily to say like James Baldwin is here and you kind of are here or something along those lines. But I just wanted to ask you to take a moment to speak to not simply the question of the possibility of, you know, or the various different ways folks can be honest in this particular institution, but also is there place for, or is there possibility for solidarity, and what in particular has your experiences, what are the ways in which your experiences have left you hopeful or not hopeful about those kind of possibilities? Does that make sense?
It does.
Yeah.
It does. Thank you. Yeah. Paradoxically, I'm both more hopeful and less hopeful. And I think in sort of exploring the, you know, the idea of hell in relation to the United States current situation, I think I was mostly trying to process a language to make sense of, you know, the general vibe that of an empire in decline, right? You know, and then to, you know, to think about what the ways that so many people, myself included, all of us really have to recalibrate, right, our understanding of possibility in an era, right, where the repression is not only so open but so openly celebrated. There's never been a time in U.S. history where these tactics were absent. You know, there are always communities, racialized communities, indigenous communities, you know, ideological communities who suffered the overt force and brutality of the state. But I think this is the first time for a lot of people to see the United States in a much different light than they've been sort of coerced into imagining it. So the possibilities of solidarity, I think, in this environment are they're hopeful in that a lot of people are, by necessity, in some cases, coming to an understanding that, oh, wow, maybe all of those things I learned about the exceptionally democratic nature of the United States aren't so true after all. So there are conversations to be had, right? There's a community to be built around this emerging recognition. But at the same time, the less hopeful part comes from the sheer level of power, right, arrayed against us. So I think what people are doing on college campuses, especially students, has really been phenomenal, super courageous. What the people are doing at UMass is really courageous. I mean, in this environment, even organizing a talk about Palestine is really courageous. There's so many contingencies, and it's the current environment is deeply hostile. I was going to say not unconducive to this kind of event, but I would say deeply hostile, right, to this kind of event, to this kind of conversation. So even though a lot of people are fed up, a lot of people are scared, a lot of people want to act, right? Those are profound positives, right? In terms of organizing and potential sites of solidarity. But at the same time, the state has bared its teeth in a way that I think I said in my prepared comments that makes it appear indomitable. That even local police forces are armed like little militaries. All of the capital is accumulated, right, in very specific sectors and in very few hands. But I go back to the note on which I ended the talk, that I see solidarity as really in this moment as a form of endurance. So if the power of the state seems insuperable, then we still endure. And if the only thing that we end up accomplishing is creating, right, a legacy around the idea of freedom for ensuing generations, so Baldwin and so many others did, right, then we'll have done something deeply important, for those who come after us, keeping the idea of freedom alive, right? Keeping the idea of justice alive. We can do that, but we endure in part, and now I'm speaking of those of us in Western spaces, and I know that we're all in different situations, economically and politically, but those of us here, there's something of a choice attached to it that doesn't exist for the people in Palestine, right, and other parts of the world where, they're made to endure, right? And then people are always talking, by the way, about like Palestinian violence, and like it's something atavistic to them, right? It bothers me because like in my mind the response is always I can promise you, I can guarantee you that the huge majority of Palestinians would rather be doing anything else, right, but resisting military occupation. All right, they would be rather having picnics. You know what I mean? They'd rather be playing video games. They'd the things that annoy us in our day-to-day lives. They'd rather be doing all of that. So nobody's choosing this stuff. Okay, and so I see like this idea of endurance not only as a form of solidarity in a moral sense, but in a political and material sense as well. That the solidarities now are transnational, right? And that we're beginning to see, well, we've seen for a long time, but the what happens in Palestine is profoundly influential to what happens in the United States. And so people who spent a lot of time ignoring it, saying, well, that's over there, are beginning to see that life is changing dramatically here because of what's over there. Right. So everything is much closer together. No, I'm in really generally a state of pretty profound ambiguity these days, because I think, I don't because I don't feel like we lack creativity or that we lack ideas. I feel like we lack power. And it's just a damn hard thing to ask people, right? To take on a source of power that's so incredibly brutal in the moment.
So I'm going to ask one more question, and just want to remind folks in the audience, and we started to get a trickle online of this kind of space for questions, right? So I didn't say this to you before, but I was at University of Illinois in 2014 and saw from a slightly kind of skewed perspective some of what took place there. And I think one of the things that has struck me, both not just about your particular situation, but just more broadly in terms of how this the current political moment surrounding the genocide in Gaza, that one of the things that sort of has been kind of lost in the conversation and seems to be sort of like a kind of undercurrent to some degree, and I say this as a Black person, is a certain level of acceptable racism, in the sense of being willing to say that in the kind of language of like, certain lives are valuable, certain lives are not valuable. Yeah. And I can't quite say necessarily that reared its head necessarily in the case of your firing at the University of Illinois, but it definitely seems to be sort of an ever-present kind of aspect of how folks talk about Palestine. And I wanted to know, perhaps you might have some perspective on this from your particular position in Egypt or what have you, but is there a way in which you have a sense of how this kind of like the dynamics of racism, something that Baldwin was like particularly attuned to, play out in this particular moment, particularly not just, we talk about racism, we mostly sort of think about questions of like skin color and what have you, but on a more brute level, on like whose life is worthwhile and whose life is not worthwhile. Yeah. The way in which that seems to be sort of like a feature of how American society seems to be kind of organized at this moment.
Yeah, I'll give it a try. That's an important set of of questions that you're raising, and and if I'm sort of veering from what you had in mind, please do interrupt and set me back on course, because no question of like racism and Palestine arises. I tend to get to ranting, and I don't want to 15 minutes later over there looking like, what the hell is he talking about, but yeah, I think it exists sort of on that existential plane of who matters and who doesn't. But Illinois was, it was an interesting situation, in part because the position that from which I had been fired was in American Indian Studies, and so there was an inbuilt hostility already there, to that program, and an inbuilt hostility, right, to indigenous peoples in Illinois. Particularly, this is kind of at the height of, or amid anyway, as you remember, the the protests against the chief imagery and somebody, the mascot, basically, the Indian mascot. And so there was a lot of resentment if not outright racism, sort of directed at American Indians, right, or against Native nations. And so I think all of that there was a sort of a confluence there, between a pre-existing hostility to Palestinians and as anti-Zionists. Right? Those are two different things, right? And a corresponding hostility to Native Americans and to indigenous peoples more broadly. And these are forms of racism that, they don't necessarily rotate or function around physiology or perceptions of physiology. They often, rotate around like allegiance and status and positionality. But what I'd say about it is that we've spent so many years debating the question of what is or isn't anti-Semitic. And that's an important question. I'm not disavowing that question, all right? And I'm talking about on the left, on the academic left, or even the activist left, to the degree that there's overlap, all right? We spent so many times sort of exploring that question, taking it seriously, all right? Thinking about its consequences and implications, right? Okay. But because we had thought of ourselves and continue to think of ourselves as people who are against racism, right? And, or against any sort of hostility, whether it's based on biological determinism or appearance or anything else. Well, how many times in those same spaces did we ever really explore the question of racism as it's inherent to Zionism itself? Hardly any, all right? And my proposition, right, it's not mine alone, a lot of people feel similarly, is that Zionism in itself is inherently an expression of racism against Palestinians for various reasons, not necessarily biological reasons, I guess you could say, right? Insofar as the religious or the ethnic identity is passed along and inherited, but Zionism in all of its incarnations ultimately requires the non-existence of Palestinians, right? It requires a cleansing of the land, right? It requires, right, a society of rigorously defined insiders and outsiders. And so people would look at somebody's position on Zionism or Israel as, okay, it's a disagreement. And I think I and a lot of others would kind of recoil at that and say it's not it's like saying that, I'm an anti-Black racist, but it's a disagreement. It's okay. We can agree to disagree, though the fuck we cannot disagree to disagree. Do you know what I mean? And that's kind of how we felt about Zionism, but that the question, right, of its exclusionary nature, right, of its violent nature vis-a-vis Palestinians was severely underexplored, right? And even now, right, as a genocide has been happening, right, and as we're seeing these images across our screen, people are reverting back to the same question of in what ways is it appropriate or inappropriate to talk about Israel, right? Well, why are we even asking that question right now, right? There's a genocide on. So the question of racism vis-a-vis Palestinians is one that emerges from Zionism, but more than that, it's a question that kind of emerges in a sense, ironically, by its absence in the discourse.
So before you continue on, sorry.
No, I'm done.
Before you continue on that rant, we do have to make sure we take some time for questions from the audience. So are the folks in the audience who have any questions? We can take 2 or 3 and give Stephen an opportunity to respond.
Hi. I was wondering why you think there's like a conflation between anti-Semitism and Zionism. So like why is that used as an argument from like Israeli people as, oh, this is like anti-Semitic to support Palestinians?
Yeah.
Because to me, I think it's pretty obvious that it's just like a people standing up to their oppressor and it's not about the religion. But I think because it's made about the religion, that's what riles up so many Jewish people in America and it makes it a lot more of like a hot button topic.
Right on. Right on.
Let's
We can
see if we
put
can
some
do
more.
a couple more.
Thank you so much for this beautiful talk. So my question's coming as a faculty member. So, as you know, as you can guess, being part of the American Academy over the last couple of years, brought to light the hypocrisy of the Academy in a way that became just absolutely unbearable. And so, I've very much been in a process of trying to reorient and figure out my relationship to this job, to this industry. You mentioned something about something like being in academia but not in it or something like that, and kind of writing quietly. And I was just wondering if you could say more about how you've come to peace with your being part of this industry, and how you continue to kind of act morally every day while knowing that you know that there is this hypocrisy that we have to kind of question in ourselves and yeah, in our environment.
And there's one more over there. Or, one over there.
Thank you so much. I really appreciated your talk. I was really struck by the point that you made about thinking about how we could shift from, well, I heard it as kind of thinking about winners or losers or my individual benefit versus collective benefit, to thinking about the future and what we're leaving for future generations. And somewhere in there, I wondered if story has a place, right? Because you're also a storyteller. How can stories help us to think about not whether we're winning or losing, but what are we giving to the children who come after us?
One more?
How would you convince a Zionist that asking for a globalization of an intifada does not require a violent upbringing, but more of just a powerful uprising from Gazan people?
Okay. I didn't quite get it. Could you repeat?
How would you convince a Zionist that asking for a globalization of the Antifada does not require violence, but more of just an uprising for people in Gaza?
I know we're running low on time. People are starting to flee. So I'm going to try to answer these concisely with apologies if the answer's not satisfactory. So I'm going to start with the first one that was asked about anti-Semitism. I mean, it's a long, convoluted process, but I think that a lot of Jewish people genuinely believe that, criticizing Israel is anti-Semitic. I don't think that, I think that some people are raised into that idea and believe in that idea. And so, I'm not even in a lot of cases challenging the validity of the feeling. I think the feeling is there. But part of it also is the way that Zionist rhetoric has sort of developed over the past, let's say, half century. And what I mean by Zionist rhetoric developing is the way that people have set out to defend Israel, or the existence of Israel, the idea of Israel, and as that it's a unique possession of the Jewish people, which is how Israel defines itself legally. And it's a source of potential refuge for Jewish people around the world, right, in the event of like another Holocaust. So the conflation of Jewishness, right, or even Judaism with the state of Israel, I think is so widespread in the public consciousness precisely because that was one of the main rhetorical tactics that the Zionist thought leaders and Zionist organizations sort of put forward. And it's also proven to be incredibly effective at shutting down opposition to, I'm not even going to say opposition to Zionism, just opposition to Israeli policies, right? First of all, people don't want to be called like racist, I mean, if somebody is calling you, an anti-Semite, a racist, you're going to take a step back and, okay, this is a heavy charge, man, like, WTF. But more than that, people understand as soon as that label gets put on them, they got a problem on their hands. Right? They got a problem on their hands in terms of their job. Right? They got a problem on their hands in terms of their mobility, in terms of their reputation, right? And so all of those factors go into this conflation that you speak of. So part of it part of it is just I think household ethos, right, where the idea of Israel is sort of presented as an existential question. Part of it is tactical, a rhetorical tactic of conflating the two, and part of it is its effective usage as a way to punish critics of Israel or anti-Zionist. There are a lot more things going on, but it's kind of the compacted answer. And then of course there's a long tradition, of course, going back, to as soon as Zionism emerged, there was a corresponding, right, intellectual tradition, right, among diasporic Jews warning against the dangers of making that sort of conflation, right, and trying to de-link the two. And that intellectual tradition still is very much in existence. So to your question, thank you for the kind words. I think for me, it's my relationship to Academe changed because, in part because I was outside of it for 5 years, and a lot happened in that 5 years. But I came back into it with the attitude that this is not an avocation. This is a job, right? And I'm going to do my job. And in terms of like the idealistic stuff, about making a difference, and I was going to put all of my energy towards my classes, right, towards teaching in a way that I never had before, and that's really been wonderful. Towards just guiding my graduate students and giving as much time as I can to undergraduates. It's just a job. And I haven't really come to peace. You use the phrase like sort of come to peace. I haven't. I don't know that any of us anymore is going to be at peace, but I think of it as a job. And part of that is because I understand the inherent limitations of a place like AUC. We can talk about Palestine all we want. There's no problem there. All right. That's not verboten in Egypt. And I'm not going to talk about the military dictator, right? But we can talk about Palestine all we want. That's fine. There is some level, actually, believe it or not, of academic freedom at AUC that no longer exists in most campuses in the United States. But there are so many people coming in from Gaza, as genocide refugees, right? And so much work in turn to involve ourselves in raising money and in donating things, in collecting stuff, and these sorts of things keep me busy. And these are not like what you call maybe like the public forms of activism that I had been involved in the past. And I'm not disparaging public forms of activism here. It's something different for me. I'm just kind of carrying on and getting my sense of trying my best to do something helpful or meaningful by giving money where it's needed. Do you know what I mean? Like the money from this is going straight into Gaza. Do you know what I mean? Working with people there, trying to help people from Gaza, the ones who I encounter to help them acclimate and get settled, these sorts of things. But, I do try to act morally, but I should say that I mean, I often fail. I'm more flawed than I would like to be, but I'm trying. Again, this brings me into the transition to the next question. It's a legacy. I don't mean my legacy. I mean like the set of ideas about possibility that we leave in our wake, that we leave behind. And this is why not conceding or giving up is so super important. Right? Because if we concede, then what's going to fill that space? The colonizer is going to fill that space. The oppressor, the racist is going to fill that space. That is hopeless as everything seems, under Trump, in the face of this massive persecution that we're seeing now, that's affecting so many people, that's terrifying so many people. It's okay. It's not going to last forever, right? And we can make sure it doesn't last forever by again keeping these ideas alive and keeping them as a legacy. And that's where I think story comes in. And that story can happen in this kind of environment. It can happen when we write fiction. It can happen, when we're eating dinner with our families. All right, it happens all the time. But to me, story is it's incredibly important. It's incredibly meaningful, right? And you feel like through the medium of story, that not just the catharsis of saying something and then having being listened to, but sort of the power of feeling like you have transmitted something of note to another human being, and thus you two are connected in a way that's lasting and permanent. And to the final question about tell me if I get it incorrect. Convincing a Zionist that calls for globalizing the Intifada are not inherently violent. Okay, I don't want to give you a glib answer. I want to give you a serious answer, but start with a caution that it's in this moment particularly, and obviously depending on who your audience is, it's very difficult to convince a Zionist of anything right now that has to do with Palestinians not in and of themselves threatening their existence, right? That's just difficult. And I want to make clear, I'm not talking about the Jewish community. I'm talking about Zionists and people who are invested in Zionism, right? It goes beyond Jewish Zionists. It goes beyond Christian Zionists. I'm talking about administrators who are invested in Zionism, politicians who are invested in Zionism, those who see in Zionism something, right, that benefits their class/economic interests. They are what's the right word? They are incentivized, right, against not listening. All right, and so I understand we're gonna come into contact and thus conflict or some kind of dialogue with people with ideological antagonists. So there's no avoiding it. And these conversations are going to happen. These arguments are going to happen. But in the end, I would really recommend for you and everybody else to focus on what you want to say, right, about Palestine and Palestinians based on the sensibilities and sensitivities of the Palestine National Movement and the Palestine Solidarity Movement in turn, and in the end, not worry how it lands, right, to people who are, very good at misreading and misinterpreting according to their own ideological needs. Do you want to say something? What's that? What's that? Yeah, of course. Ah, okay. So were you asking me then to convince you that it's not okay.
Okay. I think when most people use it, they're not thinking of violence, but in this point, even so. No, even so. Like I don't think that we can compromise on this because the question of violence is completely the domain of the genocide heir. You know, and I don't think that Zionists, right, whether super intense Zionists or liberal wishy-washy Zionists, right? They are in absolutely no position, right, to lecture anybody else about violence. You know, they're just in the process of slaughtering tens of thousands of children. So if they want to raise the question of violence, I ain't even listening to them. Do you know what I mean? It's like violence, really. You're conferring violence to me, to us? No. And this is what I was getting at earlier. I know that the time is up. The way that any Palestinian perspective or Palestinian subjectivity is constantly subsumed, right, to the sensibilities of the oppressor. And that's something I'm always warning my students against. You see a conflict, all right? You are absolutely conditioned, right? And this is just basic Gramscian theory of hegemony here. You are absolutely conditioned to identify, right, with the more powerful party to any given conflict without even thinking about it. That's what common sense tells you to do. That's what common wisdom tells you to do. All right. And Israelis have made it so that the question of violence is one that they feel like they have a right to ask about. They don't. All right. It's the Palestinians who are suffering the violence.
All right. Well, if we can give one more appreciation for Dr. Salaita for his talk tonight.
Thank you.
For those who are in person, we have we're going to have a short bit of time for folks to get their book signed, and just want to appreciate everyone for taking the time tonight. These are very dangerous and uncertain times, and it really behooves us to be able to take the opportunity to come together and to say difficult things and hear them out. Sometimes get into a little rant, sometimes ask complicated questions. So thank you.